Everyone, thank you for joining us for this question and answer session about human trafficking investigations in South Carolina. My name is David Weissman. I am the investigative projects reporter for the Sun News in Myrtle Beach, and I have been covering this topic for the past few years. Most recently, we did a story exposing an investigation into Horry County massage parlors, where we found that a taxpayer-funded private investigator was engaging in sex acts with potential trafficking victims. That story received a ton of feedback and questions, so I wanted to do this to give our readers the opportunity to get those questions answered. First off, let me introduce our two panelists who were so gracious to join us for this discussion. First, we have Jane Anderson, who is an attorney advisor for Equitas, which is a nonprofit aimed at improving prosecution practices related to human trafficking. Jane is also a former prosecutor in Miami, where she tried many of Florida's first human trafficking cases and was a founding member of the Human Trafficking Unit, where she developed policies to better identify and provide necessary services to sex and labor trafficking victims. Jane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David, and thank you for your reporting on this particular incident in South Carolina.
Of course. Also, we have Senator Stephen Goldfin, representing South Carolina's 34th District, which includes parts of Horry, Georgetown, and Charleston counties. Stephen is a partner at his law firm, Goldfin Winslow, LLC, where he focuses on civil, criminal, estate, and probate litigation. And he has been among a handful of local legislators here during the past few years that have helped push forward legislation to strengthen human trafficking-related laws in South Carolina. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator Goldfin.
Thank you, David.
Okay. So we have received lots of questions from our readers at the Sun News and the state, which I'm going to mix in with some questions of my own just to keep the conversation moving. And I also want to note for those of you watching live, feel free to comment with any additional questions you may have, and I will try to get those asked as well. And if not, I'll make sure to go back into the comments section after this is over and answer you directly as best I can. I'm going to start with a question for Jane, just to sort of set a baseline for this discussion. And that is, what exactly is human trafficking, and why does it seem like the public is hearing so much more about it in recent years?
Well, human trafficking can either be sex trafficking or labor trafficking, but at the heart of it, it's all about exploitation. So we're really talking about predators, offenders who are identifying vulnerable populations within our communities and exploiting them for their own financial gain. We're hearing more about it, which is a good thing, because it's kind of getting some news going. Unfortunately, some of it is probably skewed. So those of us that have been working on human trafficking for the last decade or so are constantly trying to make sure that the myths and misconceptions about trafficking are kind of, combated by the realities. So, for example, victims of human trafficking don't need to be transported anywhere. When I was picking juries in Miami and trying to sort of educate the folks about what types of cases they were going to hear, I always wanted to say, this is really about exploitation, not transportation. And also that, these are sometimes victims in our very own backyard. And so when we have these misconceptions out there, which of course is happening more and more, then we also have people that are misidentifying what trafficking looks like and who the victims of trafficking are.
I'm going to segue that into a question for Senator Goldfin, because you and I had an interesting discussion about this the last time we spoke that I think a lot of our audience could probably relate to. And that is just, can you please explain how far you've come in your understanding of what human trafficking is since becoming an elected official?
Yeah, I've come a long ways. I've had a complete transformation, evolution on this. I used to view these folks as prostitutes, quite honestly. And today I view them as victims, and appropriately so. Many of them are taken from their homes. Many of them are taken from their countries and shipped across state lines or country lines. with poor conditions, very little food or water, and many of them are drugged. And, being a parent myself, it breaks my heart to think that my daughter could end up in a similar situation, or any of our daughters could end up in a similar situation. So my perspective has completely changed on this.
Right. And I know we spoke mostly about the potential need for new legislation to prevent what happened in this massaging investigation from happening again. But I did also want to give you, Senator Goldfin, a chance to highlight some of the positive steps you've seen South Carolina take toward combating human trafficking in recent years.
Well, I mean, quite frankly, the evolution that you mentioned, that's got to be the biggest step forward, is changing hearts and minds. We have had some legislation. We've had a lot of interaction between solicitors and attorney generals. We had some legislation which actually smoothed that transition process, where you have the ability to go out, search these people down, have task force, but none of that really matters if you don't change hearts and minds. And I think finally, after 5-6 years of us tackling these issues and talking about these issues, the public has come to see these sex trafficking victims the way that I now see them, no longer as prostitutes, but as victims. And that has to be the biggest impact, the biggest change that I've seen in South Carolina. These women, let me just be clear, some of them may be prostitutes. Many of them are not. Many of them are not. Many of them are, in fact, victims. And identifying them as such is the biggest step forward in a century in terms of women's rights. In my opinion, it has been a tremendous leap forward in that arena. And I think we've got a long ways to go, though. As your investigation has pointed out, David, there are still some that have this lackadaisical idea, and maybe that's not the right phrase, but maybe ambivalence to the woman's plight in favor of dealing with the business owner. And I find that to be abhorrent. We're supposed to be looking after victims. And so I think we've made a lot of progress, but I think we still have a lot of progress to make.
Getting back to the investigation side of things, which is what we wanted to kind of feature in this discussion. Jane, as somebody that's worked with law enforcement, that's been, a prosecutor in the past, what are some of the most frequent issues you've seen with regard to the way some law enforcement agencies handle potential trafficking situations?
Well, I think like the senator mentioned, there's been a real evolution over the last decade or so or more. And so we see jurisdictions that have sort of started this evolution earlier than other jurisdictions. So really early on, the focus was on sex trafficking and sort of pivoting from prostitution to, okay, maybe some of these folks are victims. So what happened is folks were continuing to do prostitution stings where they were basically arresting the women and then just sort of giving them an opportunity to tell us they were victims. And that's how these investigations started. Because there was this natural intersection. It was the work that was already being done, and they were just adding this layer to it, right? And so that has continued to evolve. And so now sometimes when folks do these operations, there's victim service providers there. Some places have no arrest policies, and we're kind of moving away from that original style of undercover stings, because we're recognizing that even though we're giving victims or giving women and sometimes men opportunities to disclose in theory, in reality, these aren't meaningful opportunities to tell us what's going on when the victims, potential victims, are under arrest, have just had a traumatic experience of interaction with police, don't have any meaningful access to services, have fear for all the repercussions, have all these, have had historical bad interactions with police. They're not going to magically all of a sudden say, okay, now I trust you. now I'm going to tell you everything that's going on in my life. So we're really trying to keep moving forward in that direction of recognizing the trauma of the actual trafficking experience, understanding the trauma, which is oftentimes the law enforcement intersection with potential trafficking victims, and start figuring out how can we do this in a way where we're providing potential victims a meaningful opportunity to disclose and access services that would be actually helpful and reduce harm.
Okay. And question we just got on Facebook, kind of falling into that. What areas are resources most needed to address the human trafficking issue? And they suggest, is it prevention? Is it identification? Is it prosecution?
All of the above. Yeah, I think, there's been a real sort of thought process behind this. And so there are federal grants that basically help folks on all of these regards. So from that prevention side, trying to do even sort of school, like middle school and high school, to start having a conversation about what exploitation looks like, what coercive control looks like, online safety, some of these basic like foundational topics that are age appropriate, but then can start sort of setting the tone for further conversations. So I think there's some work happening there in that regard. But the real prevention, right? If the biggest pathway to trafficking and exploitation is that there is some vulnerability, right? Whether that be you don't have a job, you don't have immigration status, you've been criminalized and don't have access to housing, whatever that vulnerability that the offender is identifying and exploiting, it's incumbent upon us to also identify it and try to, minimize or avoid that vulnerability. So that's really, kind of where the movement is going to. And then, of course, identifying it, recognizing that it doesn't look like it does in the movies, and that if we're looking for, a scenario out of Taken, then we're missing the scenario that may be, a young girl in our foster care system within our own community, or we're missing our LGBTQ youth that don't feel safe at home, or we're missing, undocumented folks that are working in our essential jobs. And then the prosecution piece, that's that offender focus. We all, from my perspective, that's kind of the lane that I started in, right? Which was like, okay, let's get these offenders and hold them accountable. And let's figure out ways to do that are not going to be traumatizing for the victims. And so there's a lot of work being done on all fronts. So your reader has really identified all three of those. So.
Okay. And then one question I got from a reader previously, and I think kind of gets at the heart of the major issue with the story with the massage parlors, and something you and I talked about at length previously, and that is whether all sex workers, whether they're willing or not, are they considered to be victims of sex trafficking? And I that was their way of phrasing it. I kind of wanted to phrase it another way. Whether all sex workers should be considered potential sex trafficking victims, and how that might impact how law enforcement enforces, say, prostitution laws.
Well, I think Senator Goldfin really hit it on the head, which is instead of, starting off assuming they're all prostitutes and maybe allowing for the fact that some may be victims, I think the sort of the switch is, okay, let's start with perhaps they're all victims. And then let's figure that out from there. It's a hot topic right now, having conversations about what it looks like to be a voluntary sex worker. And that's not really, at the heart of this question. The heart of this question is, how do we want to start that, right? And how do we want to sort of, if we're looking at, in this case, some massage parlors that people think illegal activity is going on, where are we going to sort of pivot and figure out where our focus is? Is our focus going to be on who's making the money, or is it going to be on, the workers within the establishment? And so that's kind of where the shift is coming from. but legally, so I'll finish answering the question. Legally, if you're under the age of 18 and you're engaging in any kind of commercial sexual activity, you are legally a victim of human trafficking. If you are over the age of 18 and you're engaging in commercial sexual activity, you are legally a victim if there's been any sort of force, fraud, or coercion involved. And coercion is a really broad topic that can include things like providing drugs and alcohol, or even withholding drugs and alcohol from someone that may be addicted. It includes withholding documents. It includes threatening arrest or deportation. So coercion is sort of this really large bucket of activity that could be involved. But if you're over 18, there needs to be some element of force, fraud, and coercion to be considered a victim of human trafficking.
Okay. And Senator Goldfin, as someone who has a seat at the table when it comes to shaping laws that could promote this sort of victim-centric approach that I think most advocates are pushing for, how do you internally balance the need to make sure law enforcement has the support it needs to stop criminal activity, while also trying to ensure potential victimized aren't re-victimized as part of that process?
Well, as obvious as it should sound, I think one of the first and most obvious steps is to prevent police and investigators from having sex with victims. I mean, you would just think it's so funny to say, it's laughable, but it's also so sad to say that we have to actually think about putting that into statute. I see this as totally different from a DEA or DU agent that has to infiltrate a drug ring or a cartel and has to use or carry drugs on him or herself in order to prove his or her bona fides. I see this as totally different, because that's for the most part, that is a victimless crime other than the investigator, him or herself. Having sex with a victim is re-victimizing that person again. And to do it on the taxpayer's dollar is nothing short of a tragedy. And so I think we have to start with the obvious. We have to start with the folks that are charged with enforcing these laws and make sure they're not re-victimizing the victims. I think that's where you've got to start, David, and I intend on moving in that direction in the very near future.
Okay. And another question we just got from Facebook, maybe Senator Goldfin, you might be aware, what sort of resources there are in South Carolina for business owners, to help train their staff to identify possible trafficking?
Private business owners?
Yeah.
Well, I know that there has been a number of recent public service announcements, and there's been some money that's been set aside and billboards have been bought. You've probably seen billboards on Highway 17 in most places, and I think there's a few on Highway 501 in Horry County as well that says recognize the signs of being coerced. As Jane was saying earlier, recognize the signs, and it's got a young lady that's leaned over a car. That's just not good enough. We need to go farther. There does need to be education. Like I said earlier, I think there's an evolution moving in this direction to assume these women are victims, but recognizing the signs that they are becoming victims before they become the victim. Recognizing those signs is incredibly important, and I think we ought to pour more money into those resources to try to do that. Now, which agency should be responsible for that? Maybe that's the Attorney General's office. Maybe we need to be looking at the Human Affairs Commission. That probably would be an even better place rather than a prosecution-centric agency. Maybe we ought to be looking at a place that is charged with taking care of people. But either way, I agree with the premise. More money needs to be put into identifying the signs and symptoms of this so that we can stem it at its core.
Okay. One kind of final multi-part question from a reader we got that probably either of you can jump in on. I guess we'll start with Jane. How do we, as this is somebody from the public, just how do we make the public more aware of human trafficking, and how can I, as a member of the public, get involved on the front lines as far as increasing that awareness and helping, thwart this crime?
So I think one of the most important things to do is, when you're having conversations or you're trying to share information, that you're vetting that information, that you're not just taking something that you see on Facebook, including this, and you're really, maybe, running it by somebody that that's doing the actual work. So you don't want to be spreading this misinformation, because that really is it's hurtful to identifying the true victims of trafficking. There are a lot of folks that want to be involved, and it's so great to know that there is this kind of public push to help out. However, the frontline kind of help really requires some advanced and specialized training. So you don't get, mixed up with folks that, maybe trying to do really good work, but really don't have the training and expertise needed. Because when we're dealing with highly traumatic crimes and victims that have been traumatized probably multiple times throughout their lives, we want to make sure we're doing it right. But there are tons of organizations that need funding. Like all of the resources that a victim may need to exit a trafficking situation need funding. So it can be everything from, donating gift cards to your local shelter, or the folks that are doing direct services to victims, or helping raise money for, those shelters and those direct services that have the expertise and just need additional resources.
Okay. And Senator Goldfin, did you have anything to add in terms of what somebody in South Carolina could do to, try to get involved with this?
Well, I'm going to look at it. I think Jane looked at it from the right perspective. I'm going to look at it from the perspective of a legislator. Anybody listening to the sound of my voice, I hope, is concerned about this issue. And if you are a constituent of if you live in the state of South Carolina, you're a constituent of someone. You're a constituent of a senator and a House member. I would highly encourage you to reach out to them and tell them this is important to you. It's important to our daughters, and to stop ignoring it if they are. Some of us are not. But like I said, this is an evolution. I think there's a number of people that still think these women are prostitutes, and we've got to pull them along, kicking or screaming. We've got to pull them along, and eventually we'll get there. But it's incumbent upon our constituents. It's what representative democracy is all about. It's incumbent upon our constituents to bring us along. And so anybody listening to this, I'd say reach out to your House member and your senator and encourage them to move legislation further and further towards recognizing these women as victims, and just as importantly, identifying the wrongdoers, the bad guys that are trafficking these women, and putting them in jail.
Okay. And I also wanted to chime in on this question myself by noting South Carolina does have a human trafficking task force through the Attorney General's office, with multiple regional offshoots. I know Horry and Georgetown County have the coastal regional task force, and they're always looking for volunteers to help, increase awareness, increase education throughout their communities. I know they go to schools sometimes and do that sort of education stuff. Plus, I do want to add, if you suspect you've witnessed a case, or you are somebody who feels that you are in a human trafficking situation, there is an outlet. Please call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and that number is 1-888-373-7888, and tips to that line can be made anonymously if needed. So that is all the time we have today. I want to again thank Jane Anderson and Senator Goldfinch for joining us and answering our reader questions. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. And if I need to, I can get it to one of them and kind of try to make sure everybody's questions get answered. Thank you to our Sun News and state readers for listening and watching, and for asking such great questions. Your continued support makes conversations like these possible as we work to continue covering important topics in our communities. And please consider subscribing to make sure we can continue that work. Hope everybody has a great rest of your afternoon, and feel free to reach out to me by email or social media with news tips anytime.